Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Brennan Center for Justice event. I'm Lisa Benenson, Vice President for Communications and Strategy at the Brennan Center. In just a moment, I'm going to turn you over to our moderator for this event, Sewell Chan, Editor-in-Chief of the Texas Tribune. And as you know, we have a standout group of panelists who we've managed to lure away from their nonstop lineup of television appearances. They're going to spend the next hour with us and answer your questions as well as ours. But before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. In addition to being broadcast on our Brennan Center platforms, we're excited to announce that this event is also airing live on C-SPAN Channel 1 and C-SPAN Radio. If this is your first time with us, the Brennan Center for Justice is a nonpartisan law and policy institute that works to repair, revitalize, and when necessary, defend our systems of democracy and justice. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please feel free to add them via YouTube and Facebook chat. Civility is important to all of us at the Brennan Center. Those who post rude or intemperate language in our message streams here on YouTube and Facebook will be removed from the conversation. We will be live tweeting today's event. Please follow the conversation at #BrennanCenterLive. And lastly, we do provide live closed captioning. And without further ado, Sewell, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lisa, and hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. The 2022 midterms have been billed as the most consequential in decades, and the mixed verdict that the nation delivered yesterday shows how profound and enduring some of the political divisions are. Americans took to the polls to vote on issues like inflation, voting rights, immigration, crime, abortion, and democracy itself. While we don't yet have a full picture of all of the results, so far they have been eye-opening. Today, we have three foremost experts to unpack what has unfolded so far, what races and measures we're still waiting for results on, and what the next steps for both parties and their leaders might be. This fantastic panel for you today comprises David Plouffe, an architect of President Obama's two presidential campaigns and a leader in the fields of technology and philanthropy. Rob Jesmer, managing editor at FP1 Strategies, who has been a leading strategist for both the Republican National Committee and the party's campaign committees for both House and Senate. And finally, Elise Jordan, MSNBC and NBC political analyst and writer who served at the State Department and the National Security Council during the presidency of George W. Bush. Let's get started. David, how did the Democrats end up doing better than expected?
I don't think we know yet, to be honest. We'll be unpacking that. I'll have a few thoughts. First of all, I want to thank Lisa Benenson and the team at Brennan Center for this event and for the great work they do on issues that are so fundamental to our democracy. I think part of what happened here was, you recall during the summer, post-Dobbs decision at the Supreme Court, Democrats were posting big leads in polls. Over September and October, those leads shrank largely because Republicans and Republican-leaning independents came home to Republican candidates. But I think there was a view, largely because we've seen in the last few elections polls be way off and for the most part underestimate Republican strength. There was a sense that the outcome would probably be worse than the polls. And it's a good reminder, like the voters always have the last word, and we should all be a little cautious about over-interpreting polls. So I think a bunch of things. One, clearly turnout amongst young people was stronger than people predicted, and that was a huge part of their success last night. Two, candidate quality matters. So I think particularly in the Senate, Republicans had some deficient candidates, and that always comes back to bite you in close races. And three, I think the party did a good job where they needed to on issues like abortion and democracy, of really talking about that, making the stakes as large as possible, and that was a good way to drive turnout. So, and I think in the House races, which get a lot less attention, some Democratic House incumbents, particularly that class of 18, a lot of them held on and won really close races that I think a lot of strategists in both parties thought might be gone. So there's a lot to unpack here because exit polls can be way off in terms of demographic breakdowns. So we'll, over the next months, and it does take months, we'll look at real vote and see what kind of patterns there were. But, obviously an unexpected outcome. And we still don't know what's going to happen in the Senate. There's still a chance that Cortez Masto, with the votes yet to come in Clark County and in Washoe County, is able to overtake her opponent. And if not, then all eyes move to Georgia once again on December 6th, which will be a runoff for Senate control. I'm sure we'll talk about that. But a lot of ingredients went into it. The other thing I'd say, Donald Trump being such a big part of the campaign, going out on the campaign trail in the last week. You'll remember in the Virginia governor's race of 2021, the Youngkin campaign and Republicans kept Trump out of the state for the most part. And I think that was a factor. His approval rating in the exit polls last night, if they're at all accurate, was 37%. So clearly a drag with a lot of swing voters, I think, out there.
Quick follow-up. The midterms, of course, are seen as a referendum on the sitting president. Yesterday, by some measures, might be the best night for a first-term president since 2002, when, of course, President Bush and the Republicans gained seats in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. What do you think the White House will be taking away from yesterday's results?
Well, big sigh of relief for one. Listen, I think it's a reminder that, you cannot be captive to the past. So again, if the exit polls are at all directionally right, Democrats won voters who somewhat disapprove of Joe Biden's performance. We haven't seen that in the past. So I think we better understand that the other thing that's clear is, at least in 18 and 22, I hope as an American citizen it continues, we're getting really strong turnout in off-year elections, which was not the case for like 100 years. So there's some things that I think we put into the playbook, so to speak, about how we view elections that's off. So huge sigh of relief, obviously, as it relates to democracies, not on completely sound footing yet, but I think we took a big step forward last night. But listen, it's still quite possible Republicans win the House, narrow as it may be, and win the Senate. And so Joe Biden could be facing, unified Republican control in the House and Senate. So we'll have to see as those votes are counted. But I think we overlearned a little bit of the history of approval ratings. And there were some big things going on. Inflation. A lot of voters have never dealt with inflation before, younger voters, ever. You've got democracy at risk. You've got abortion. You've got these big issues. This was a big election. And so I think voters behave differently than we might be accustomed to.
Thank you. Rob, we have been hearing about a red wave or even a red tsunami coming for months now. Did the party fall short of that objective? And if so, why?
Look, I think if you would have asked us 6 weeks ago and said this is the election we're going to have, I mean, the party generally would have been happy with it. I think clearly expectations were growing and people were getting sort of maybe a little over their skis the last couple of weeks. And I think a couple of things happened. One is, I agree with much of what David said, but generally speaking, there was a decoupling between voters' views of President Biden and how they voted. As I say, in several, going back maybe to 2002, the incumbent president, if he was, at a 40% approval rating, would have taken a shellacking in the polls, and that didn't happen last night. That's really the first time that didn't happen. And the second piece is, I think that there was President Trump was a factor in this last couple of days, which is normally the previous president isn't as big a factor as he was. So I think there's some unusual things that happened. To David's point, I think we're gonna have 228, 230 members of the House. We're going to be in the control. I think we'll also the Senate. It's unclear to me what's going to happen. My sense is we'll hold on Nevada and we'll be heading to a Georgia runoff to control that. So we'll see what happens, but I think it was certainly a little disappointing.
Rob, the Republicans, made important gains in places from Florida to New York. Where else did the party meet or exceed expectations, and where did it fall short?
Well, look, I don't think we should gloss over Florida. I think Florida was an incredible success story. Obviously, everyone knows Miami-Dade. We won convincingly, which is a gigantic deal. And I think you saw Governor DeSantis, which obviously had a decisive victory, and we won a lot of seats underneath that, legislative seats, municipality seats, and it was really an incredible showing by the DeSantis machine, which I think will be helpful to him in the future. And Texas, a state I've done a lot of work in. I mean, for 15 years, we've heard the Democrats talk about how they're going to make progress in Texas, and they really continue to have no luck there. And I think New York was interesting for other reasons, but generally speaking, I think those are the highlights. I think in a lot of other places we underperformed, and I think we have to kind of think the next couple months, really analyze what happened and how we got to this place. I mean, there's probably a few. I think all of us have some notionally have understanding what happened, but I think we really need to do some polling and focus grouping and really figure it out.
Thank you. Elise, you wrote on Twitter last night, quite a night for Democrats. 57% of Americans disapprove of Biden. Gas and groceries are going up. Crime is rising. All that gets canceled out, you wrote, when Republicans act like lunatics and scare the crap out of Americans who vote to preserve basic stability and democracy. How does last night's outcome affect President Trump and the future of the party?
Oh, I think that President Trump is still a huge force to be reckoned with. We saw what a drag he was, though, this cycle. There were at least 5 Senate seats that, if they had had decent candidates, non-Trumpian candidates, Republicans could have picked up those seats and they would have won the majority. And it should have been a very easy year for Republicans. And just, over the past month in Pennsylvania, where we went for Morning Joe and did focus groups with voters, everyone across the electorate, didn't matter how you were voting, just really fed up with the economy, with inflation, with how it's impacting their lives, feeling like crime was on the rise and it wasn't necessarily being grappled with by Democratic leadership. They weren't necessarily excited about Joe Biden or Kamala Harris as waiting in the wings. The enthusiasm just wasn't there. But then they would say, I've got to vote because it's existential. The stakes are way higher than just, my day-to-day needs. This is actually about preserving American democracy. And so you see where people at the end of the day, they did turn out. They might have been pained and conflicted to actually vote for the candidates. But unlike in 2016, when plenty of voters were willing to just take a gamble on Donald Trump, people didn't want to take a gamble on these candidates who, had extreme views on abortion and were falling into the typical Trump playbook.
Let's focus on the democracy argument, Elise. Coming into yesterday, there were many commentators. It kind of became the conventional wisdom that Presidents Biden and Obama emphasizing the democracy argument, that it was a lofty and abstract and perhaps important argument, but not nearly as kind of, day-to-day, resonating day to day with such pocketbook issues as inflation, the perhaps oncoming recession, et cetera. Did the democracy argument end up carrying, kind of more weight than you expected?
I don't think the democracy issue carried the day, but I think it was a thread that, when coupled with abortion rights being challenged and that upheaval, and with the election denial, and just the general chaos that certain candidates were seen as ushering in, it was definitely important. But this is not an easy election to just say one issue was it. There are just such a host of issues that really, when combined and over the course of time, because, if the vote had happened right after Dobbs, Democrats would have just had even a larger margin. And that was not cited as just a single issue that women were going to vote on when we were talking to women swing voters, but coupled with the other insanity, they decided just to go ahead and vote Democratic, it looks like, as judging by the results.
David, where do the Democrats go from here? The party is reasonably unified, but obviously most Americans and even, I believe, most Democrats do not wish for President Biden to run again. With probably a minority in the House and maybe even in the Senate, where do the Democrats go forward?
Well, first of all, we have a Democratic president. We had a very good night in state houses, both at the legislative level and at the gubernatorial level. So those people have to actually govern. I think sometimes we forget that part of the play. So the most important thing is do a good job, and good results tend to follow. I think as you think about politics, first of all, Joe Biden, the only two people that matter in that discussion are Joe and Joe Biden. They'll make a personal decision about whether he wants to spend another 4 years, seeking the White House and then serving as president. If he does run, he still may have a primary. I think last night probably makes it less likely that it's a serious primary. Just as I think if Donald Trump decides to run, he's going to have a primary and a serious one. But I think we don't know the first thing yet about what really happen, I agree with Rob, we can be directional. But for Democrats, it's how do you continue to maximize your support among suburban voters, college-educated voters, both men and women. Number two, if the exit polls are accurate, Republicans, got almost 40% of the Hispanic vote. So let's take away Florida, which is a unique situation. As a Democrat, you'd like to be back into the mid 60s if you can. So is there growth there? Young turnout. We saw it in 2018. We saw it in 2020. We saw it again this time. They probably demographically played the biggest role, in my view, in saving democracy, or at least putting us on that road. What do you do to keep those voters engaged and turned out? And then candidate quality. It clearly matters from president on down. And so the infrastructure work, that's the thing. There's so much money spent in politics today. I mean, most Senate races, 80, 90, $100 million. What's not being spent on the progressive side as much is the quieter money, the more important money, the infrastructure money. Year-round voter registration, year-round field organizing, year-round message. So you're telling stories about what you're trying to get done. We tend to rely on just the period of time before the election to tell our story, because the Republicans have Fox, they have Breitbart, they have Sinclair TV stations. They have much more of an infrastructure to deliver message, both positive message about what they're trying to do, but more often negative messages about the Democrats, distorted messages. So there's a lot to do there. But, listen, Florida, Ohio, Iowa, Texas, these are states, if you have any hope of putting them back into play at the statewide level or battleground state level, that's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a lot of time. But I think it's important. So the Democrats had a better election than I think most people thought, probably than a lot of Democrats thought. What you can't do in an election that you're pleased with the outcome, or at least not super depressed by, is not take a hard look at areas where you can improve. Even in Georgia, the task for both Warnock and Walker now is not to just do the same thing they did. Is okay, how can we improve our performance enough to win that runoff? So a lot of analysis has to happen here. But I think that the thing I'd leave is we're reminded time and time again, in every swing House district and every swing gubernatorial and Senate race and battleground state in a presidential race, in every single one, there are more conservatives than liberals. And conservatives tend to get more reliable turnout than liberals. So we are further away from the 50-yard line in every race that matters. And so two things has to happen. Yes, we've got to get the kind of turnout we need, essential. You have to win the moderate vote. And so, again, if exit polls are to be believed, the Democrats won independents last night, and I think that surprised a lot of people. And that's what we have to do. So we have to have messages and policies that speak to the middle of the electorate. Their concerns, their aspirations, and use language that a real person can understand. I think that's, this is going to sound self-serving, but I think former President Obama, was effective in part. Yes, he was talking about policies, but he was talking about it in a way that I think was accessible to people. So there's a lot to learn. I think if anything, we escaped the worst last night, and there's some places like Michigan and Pennsylvania that I think are actually quite promising. Flipping state houses in those places in addition to winning the gubernatorial races. But let's not underestimate the amount of work we have to do to have the kind of 24, not just the party needs, but I would argue the country needs.
What I'd like to do with each of you now is drill down a little bit into the Senate, gubernatorial, and House races just a bit, just to get a bit of granularity and benefit from your, expertise with understanding the political map. Start with David. Let's start with the Senate first of all. David, Michael Bennet in Colorado, Maggie Hassan in New Hampshire, and of course John Fetterman in Pennsylvania, all succeeded or survived or won last night. What made them successful?
Well, first of all, let's look back at 2020. Remember the conversation in the week or two before that election? Oh, is Biden going to win Texas? Oh, is Biden going to win Florida? The same thing happened here, to Rob's point about some Republicans getting over their skis. There was a sense that maybe they could win Colorado Senate, maybe New Hampshire, maybe even Washington State. So none of that was real. So I leave, obviously Hassan and Bennett ran great races, leave that aside. The Fetterman race strategically obviously couldn't have been more important because it was the one takeaway that Democrats really had the best opportunity. I mean, Wisconsin ended up being very close, which would have been a takeaway. But that just makes the math harder for Republicans. Now they have to win 2 of Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada instead of 1. So, but I think Fetterman, listen, he was a strong general election candidate. Showed the ability to last night in county after county improve on Biden's margins. He was still losing some of those counties, by the way, by 40 or 50 points. But what matters is getting that margin down. And he still showed the ability, despite showing some strength in those rural and exurban areas and blue collar areas, to do really well in the suburbs and generate the kind of turnout you need out of Philadelphia City. And I think there was so much navel gazing about his debate performance. And my view was, listen, almost everybody has someone in their family who's struggling with health issues. And I don't think he was going to be graded on that, like figure skating judges. Did he land the closing statement perfectly? So that ended up being, I think, much less of an event than people thought. But I think that was key, though. So Pennsylvania was key. Now Democrats are on the precipice. I don't think we know what's going to happen in Nevada. I talked to people in Nevada who think it could be within 100 votes when all the votes are counted. But what Democrats have to do is, yes, while we're eagerly watching what the vote counting in Nevada and Arizona, the runoff is right in front of you in Georgia. You have less than 30 days to put together a winning campaign.
Rob, I want you to have a chance here to give your Senate analysis. On the Republican side, Ron Johnson survived in Wisconsin, defeating Mandela Barnes. Ted Budd in North Carolina, a race that the Democrats had hoped to make close. He won that seat, an open seat being vacated right now. And of course, J.D. Vance in Ohio kind of, brushed aside Tim Ryan, who kind of a moderate Democrat and a union Democrat. What was the key to their successes and that of other Republican Senate candidates?
Yeah, look, I just think those states are structurally Republican states, and I think it was going to take a lot for us to lose those places. I think about North Carolina the way I think maybe we were thinking about a Colorado or something like that. It's a real reach for them, and the environment would have to be pretty incredible, I think, the Democrats to win. And I think those were always going to win. I thought Bud was always going to win. But I want to just go back a little bit to what David talked about. And Elise, look, I don't think a democracy was on the ballot. I think a democracy is fine. We don't relitigate everything that happened previously. I'm happy to at another panel. But I think what we need to look at candidate by candidate where we were. I mean, whether or not you like Dr. Oz or don't, this is guy who was a very, very wealthy and successful guy who I think had a hard time relating to people. Some people who are struggling. He lived in New Jersey for basically his entire life. You go down to New Jersey, Herschel Walker, great football career. Since then, I think has had some issues. Spent most of his time in Texas. I mean, this is not stuff where I think we were talking a lot about democracy or about election denying. I think it was about individual candidates who had a hard time sort of in the general election, sort of focusing on how to win the election. And look, there are a lot of people who President Trump endorsed who won last night. And so to me, this does get down to whether or not you have to be a good candidate and you have to run a good campaign. And in a few of these places, we didn't do that. And we had the wind at our back. I mean, we had the issue set at our back. And I think we should have done better in those places. And I think we largely didn't because our candidates were the issue. And that was the problem. I don't think it was really democracy per se or January 6th. I think it was just an inability to keep the focus on President Biden. And that's the other thing. I mean, look, just sitting where I sit, I hope President Biden runs for re-election. My guess is he'll do what a lot of people do, both sides, which he'll misread the results and sort of believe what he wants to believe. But I don't think he's going to be a very strong candidate in a couple of years. And I can't imagine if you took a poll of Democrat operatives or members of Congress and said they want President Biden to win, there would be anybody who'd say they would. So I think, there's a whole sort of issue set coming down the road for the Democrats as well as the Republicans who we deal with.
Elise, what's your assessment of where the Senate goes, and in particular, the still ongoing races in Arizona, Nevada, and Georgia?
It looks like Mark Kelly is going to pull it out in Arizona, and then Cortez Masto too in Nevada. If I had to bet, if I'm going to bet, and then looking at, it all's going to come down to Georgia again, and I wonder how much that race will mirror the special election in 2017 with Roy Moore and Doug Jones, where you actually do see Republican turnout depressed because of candidate quality that Rob was talking about. When we were in Georgia back in May, it was surprising to me how there were Republicans who really, even then, before all of the abortion scandals piled up and piled up and piled up, that Herschel Walker paid for so many abortions and had so many children he didn't acknowledge. Republicans had serious questions. So see today in the result, a lot of those voters who voted for Brian Kemp and gave him an incumbent push back into office, they didn't come out for Herschel Walker. So I think it's just all going to come down to Georgia. And I think to Rob's point, though, about democracy wasn't on the ballot, what I would say is of the candidates who fared really poorly, they were pretty Trumpian endorsed. Dr. Oz was vaunted into the nomination because of the Trump nomination. David McCormick would have probably swept away with the seat. Then you have, Blake Masters. I mean, where did he even appear on the Republican scene aside from being a Peter Thiel guy, which, that got him there. And then Herschel Walker. I mean, God only knows that Mitch McConnell would have rather had someone else there too. So the Trump influence this cycle, it certainly didn't do the party leadership any favors.
Yeah. Well, Peter Thiel is, I guess, 1 for 2 in the big bets he made. Let's now focus a little bit on the governor's races. Republicans, of course, easily won and kept power in Texas and in Florida. In Texas, where I am, I would note that Beto O'Rourke actually won fewer counties than the Democrats had won, and I believe the last 5 federal elections. And $100 million went into the O'Rourke campaign. Compared to his very kind of a more obscure and kind of not well-funded, Democratic 4 years ago. And yet, Beto looks like to have lost, by around 10 points. Obviously in Georgia, Brian Kemp, once again defeated Stacey Abrams. The governor's races in Arizona, Nevada, and Oregon are too close to call. And of course, Democrats held on to governor's mansions in Kansas, Maine, Michigan, New York, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Rob, on the governor's races, did your party fall short?
I would say it was kind of a push, honestly. I think that what I think is that governor is a serious job. I mean, you can run for Congress and kind of fake it if you're a House member, sort of fake it if you're a senator. You can't fake it when you're governor. You're an executive of a state. You have there's a lot of sort of your policy and the impact you have on the governing matters to people in a way that it doesn't matter when you're running in the legislative branch. And I think what you saw was good candidates and good governors win convincingly. Not just Republican voters, but swing voters. And I think, and conversely, you saw in places like Oregon and New York, where maybe will ultimately fall short, you saw sort of a prosecution of the policy there that really allowed for an overperformance of Republicans on the policies and the governing of the Democrat incumbent. So, look, I think it would have been better to win Wisconsin. There's a few places in Kansas, certainly I wish we would have won. But I think at the end of the day, it was kind of a push.
David, national Democrats tend to fall in love with certain candidates. I think Stacey Abrams is one of them. Beto O'Rourke is another. Maybe Jamie Harrison, although that was a Senate race 2 years ago. Could those hundreds of millions of dollars been better spent?
Well, listen, a lot of people gave to those candidates because they like those candidates. There's not like some spigot that somebody in a back room in Washington is like turning on and off, right? So Beto and Stacey Abrams, motivate people. By the way, Stacey Abrams, she didn't win her governor's race, but the 2 senators we have down there, Biden's electoral votes out of there, success up and down the ballot. She's a big part of that, obviously. And Beto obviously did not get the result he wanted last night, but if you look at his performance in the Rio Grande Valley, and I think we're probably going to win 2 of those 3 House seats. I think there was a view before this election that all 3 of those could go Republican. So I think gubernatorially, I will point out New York. So yes, Hochul ended up winning, but her margin was narrow enough that the Republicans might win 5 House seats out of New York. If not 5, 4, like huge in terms of that. But, winning Wisconsin, winning Michigan, winning Pennsylvania, I think from a democracy standpoint is important. I am a little bit worried about Arizona if Kari Lake was to take the lead there. And this is why, by the way, as we think about the lame duck coming up, for me at the top of the list is the Electoral Count Act, which is something, Leader McConnell and a fair number of Republicans support, which would not completely guarantee and safeguard presidential elections, but would take a big step forward. And I think these results, yes, you can feel good that the elections are going to be prosecuted properly and legally in Wisconsin now, Michigan, Pennsylvania. That's huge. But Arizona and Nevada, we'll have to see. So I think the Senate hopefully will act and Biden will sign that really important piece of legislation.
Any other lame duck legislation that you think the Democrats can pass while they still hold the House? For example, around antitrust?
Well, my sense is, listen, there's some like NDAA authorization. Now we'll do, Washington speak. There's some like must do stuff. We'll see. I mean, there's support for that legislation, Republican and Democrat, but it did not happen, in the normal course of business. So I wouldn't assess those odds as quite high. I think it's the electoral count. Now, the other question is the debt ceiling. And is there an effort by the Democrats, while they still have the House and Senate majorities, to basically take care of the debt ceiling, either get rid of it entirely or give a lot of headroom? Because if not, with this narrow House majority, the United States of America and the global economy could staring over the abyss. Because it is hard for me, maybe Rob or Elise will have some words of wisdom here, to see how with a narrow House majority, we don't really dance with the devil here in terms of tanking the global economy. So I'm very concerned about that. So for me, it's Electoral Count Act. Let's get that done. If there's a way to handle the debt ceiling in the lame duck, that would be terrific. And if not, then this is going to be looming for the country in the first quarter of next year.
So Rob, over to you. Tell us about the debt ceiling, and tell us about, Kevin McCarthy. Will he be the next speaker? And if he does succeed, how will he actually hold the caucus together?
I think he's likely to be the next speaker. Look, I think we've all seen this movie before. I think we're going to have a debt ceiling. I think, or a government funding vote. It's likely not going to go very well. I think there'll probably be a shutdown, and I think we'll have to make a deal with Democrats, and it'll be a deal that's worse than we would have made if we on the original sort of deal that was constructed between the House and the Senate and the president. I mean, we've done this, I don't know, a dozen times in the last 10 years. I'm confident we'll do it one more time or two more times. I'm less worried than David that we're going to have some sort of global meltdown. I think there's other issues I worry more about a global meltdown than that. But I think, winning elections is easier than governing, and both parties have issues with that. And I think we'll sort of run into ours here in short order. I almost think to that point, it's so conditioned the environment. I'm sort of from electoral, like 2024 point of view, I'm less, there seems to be less impact on the election. I think people, although don't condone it, I think they're used to this sort of before. And I think it'll just kind of get work itself out in the usual course.
Rob, one more question. The last two Republican House speakers, John Boehner and Paul Ryan, and became speaker with big ideas, big ambitions. Obviously, they both ended up feeling their own deep frustrations with, managing a House majority, Republican House majority. They both dealt with kind of these debt ceiling issues as well. Does McCarthy have a chance of succeeding where, they may not have?
Look, I think it's going to play out like I just said. I think I'm not a great fan of Speaker Pelosi's policies, but I am a fan of the way she runs the House. She's very good at it. My guess is the Democrats are going to run into a few of the problems that we have now when there's new leadership over there. She's a unique political figure, and some of this just is sort of the times we're in. And I just think we're going to have to feel a little growing pains while we're in the majority.
Yeah, thank you. Now we're going to move over to the best part, audience questions. The first one I'm going to direct to Elise. What does this election mean for the big lie movement?
I think we see that there's not much of a tolerance for the big lie movement among the American electorate, aside from that hardcore 35% that's always going to stick with Donald Trump no matter what. Americans want to look forward. They are sick of looking backwards and relitigating what happened in 2020 even if they did like Trump and they wanted Trump to win re-election. So you look at what happened with a lot of the down ballot attorney general and secretary of state races, and a lot of election deniers didn't make it past the finish line, and incumbents survived. You know, Republicans like Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, he survived, and he was a Republican who wouldn't cede to Trump's demands to overturn the election results. So I think that you look at what happened at the ballot, and that would be, you know, one of my takeaways, just that it didn't seem to really be that much of a plus for Republicans. And Carrie Lake really, you know, going up against her opponent, Katie Hobbs, who didn't even debate her and seemed to be somewhat missing in action. And that Katie Hobbs is still doing so well against such an outspoken proponent of the big lie says a lot, I think, for just the staying power of that theory.
Rob, what do you make of that assessment? You seemed less convinced that, you know.
Look, this may not be a popular view amongst some here, but I think this started a while ago. And I think there's different variations of this, and but the fact of the matter is, you know, Secretary Clinton said that President Trump was illegitimate and elected because of the Russians. We go back to 2000 when George Bush was elected, and this, you know, was his election, the Supreme Court decision. And I think what happens is there is a lot of Americans who look into DC and they say, and they have trouble understanding, you know, they don't think those people relate to them at all. And so, to be clear, I think President Trump lost the election. I think the way he talked about it is just totally ridiculous and just harmful to the party and harmful to the country. But there is a thing where, you know, he gets scrutiny that no one else does get. And that's just, I think, a fact. And I love my friend David Plouffe, but when he says we don't have Fox News and these other things, it's like, well, I mean, if I was a Democratic Party, I have Hollywood, I have major sports leagues, I have New York Times, I have all these things. I mean, I think most people think all those institutions, and I are totally against them from the conservative point of view. Yeah. And so, you know, I think there's going to be, I do think that the Republican Party is going to have a robust primary. And I think, as Lise pointed out, there's basically 35% of the vote are hardcore Trump. I'm not counting Trump out at all. That to do that would not be smart based on his record before. But there is no question that he's vulnerable, and there's going to be unquestionably he's going to be a contested nomination, and I think it's going to be wide open.
Question 2: how did gerrymandering impact this election? David, do you want to tackle that?
Well, it's like candidates. You know, it differs in different places. So New York's an interesting example where there was more favorable Democratic maps passed that were rejected, you know, by local court. And that's one of the reasons the Republicans are going to have such a strong performance here. Clearly in Florida, you know, my recollection of this is the Republican state legislators down there came to agreement with Democrats on the maps, but DeSantis came in and said, no, they're not Republican enough. So, you know, DeSantis has an amazing story to tell out of this election in terms of being a more favorable option for Republicans than Trump. Big margins, you know, did very well with a lot of elements in terms of the Hispanic vote, Cuban and Venezuelans in particular, and, you know, presided over huge House gains and kind of, you know, led that effort. So I think it was mixed. I think what the most important thing here is, though, and again, a lot can change in politics over the course of a decade, but as it stands right now, the House of Representatives will probably remain quite competitive. So Democrats, if they fall short, will have a very good chance to win it back in 24. If they win it back in 24, Republicans will have a chance in 26. So that is a little bit unusual. It took in the last decade. It was really 2018, the blowout win in the first election after Trump that gave Democrats the chance. And back in the decade before that, it was 06. I think there was a common belief that Republicans were almost insulated from losing the majority, as Democrats have been for many decades. So that, I think, is important. I think on balance, there's some states that Democrats got huge advantages in redistricting, and there's some states that Republicans did. But on balance, it was not as lopsided, I think, as we've seen before. So I think that makes the House competitive should be the rest of the decade, unless something funky happens.
Question 3: how can you unpack how abortion rights, the debate over them, played out in both red and blue states? Elise, do you want to address?
Well, I actually think in Pennsylvania it made a big difference in that final debate where you had so many undecideds watching to see if John Fetterman could actually perform after his stroke, and he's going through such medical challenges. And then you have Dr. Oz have a slip of the tongue and say that abortion the decision should be made by women, their doctors, and local political officials. And so then you imagine women going to their tax assessor and asking for an abortion. That just it really made a pretty effective ad for Fetterman as a closing argument, just to paint Dr. Oz an extremist, as he'd been on pretty good behavior the last month and stayed in the background of the campaign. And then I think I'd point to Kansas too. Look at what happened there. The Democrat governor won again. Then in Kentucky, you had abortion was rejected. You had pretty much in all of the ballot initiatives about abortions, Americans voted as they respond in polls. They don't want to strictly limit abortion.
That's really helpful. Thank you. The next question, what will happen to the January 6th committee and its findings if the GOP takes control of the House? Maybe Rob and then Elise.
I mean, my assumption is they'll issue some sort of final report here in the next couple of weeks, and that will be over and then the new Congress starts.
Do you think that a criminal referral might go anywhere? Do you think that the
I don't have any idea. I don't have any idea. I think I think that it would be best for the country if people moved on from this. I think, and I don't think, look, if crimes were committed, people need to be held accountable. I also think having the Biden DOJ go prosecute a bunch of Republicans is not going to be, I think, especially well received. And I don't think it'll be helpful to the Democratic Party either, for that matter. But we'll see what happens. Obviously, that they indicted President Trump or had a search warrant of President Trump. We'll see if they're going to indict him. So they seem to be willing to kind of go full speed ahead. But as far as congressional action, I think it'll be over here in short, next couple of weeks.
Elise, your take on the January 6th committee.
I mean, I agree with Rob that I think it's just nearing its conclusion. And what the next steps from here, see what Merrick Garland and the Department of Justice, where they're going to take it and how they will proceed. And I don't want to speculate on that, but it seems to be moving from the realm of politics and airing the history of what happened, which is important for the country to know what happened, given the conspiracy theories that emerged in the aftermath, to know, the first draft of history. They did that, and now it's going to move into the legal realm.
Next question, which I'm going to direct toward David. Based on the election yesterday, are there any Democrats emerging as front runners for 2024 if Biden doesn't run?
Well, that's some dangerous territory. So, yeah, I mean, I think if Joe Biden decides to run, he may have primary opposition, but I don't think any serious. He will be the Democratic nominee. If he chooses not to run, yeah, I think if you look around the country, Gretchen Whitmer, really an amazing result in Michigan, up and down the ballot. Tim Ryan, who fell short, may think about running for president again. Mark Kelly, what an amazing biography and story he has. Raphael Warnock. I'm leaving a lot of people out, but if you take a more expansive view, obviously, if Joe Biden does not run, obviously Vice President Kamala Harris will, you would assume, be a front runner. You've got members of the cabinet who ran last time who may think about it this time. But my guess is it will be a bigger field. I think the Republican field could be quite big, whether Trump runs or not. I mean, I think what people learn is generally people wait too long to run. That's the lesson. So if you have a view that you think you would be a good president, by the way, I still think that matters. I think we oftentimes skip to who's the most electable, being a good president matters. But if you think you would be a good president and you think you could mount a serious and effective campaign for it, then generally if you say, I'll wait and I'll run it 8 years from now, by that time you're like barnacles, on an old ship. So I think you're going to see a lot of people run. And I think it'll be a fascinating race. But I think there's a lot of Democratic talent out there. Now, how much of that decides to actually seek the White House? A lot of them will decide it's not for them. But I think there are some folks out there who, last night, but also in the last few years have shown some ability. And listen, you got to remember, Rob talked about the job of an executive is much different than a legislator. It is also the way people think about those jobs, mayor, governor, president. Your policies are important, but your character, the strength of your leadership is, do people kind of want you on their smartphones for the next 4 years is really important. And so the thing I say about presidential campaigns is history shows us there's no President Fred Thompson. There's no President John Glenn. It's not how strong you are on paper. This is a dynamic process. You get thrown into the arena. And even if you've had it in prior races in your state, you may not have it at this moment. So that is what's so critically important, is who has what voters are looking for at that particular moment. And it is like a, searing proctological exam that these candidates go through. And most people don't come out of it as strong as when they went into it. So, but yeah, I think if Joe Biden does not run, I assume we'll have a pretty robust primary. I think you're going to have a robust primary, even if Trump's in. That would be my sense. Rob and Elise may tell me I'm wrong, but that's my sense.
Well, Rob, I want to stay on this 2024 subject for a moment. Rob, presumably from the Republican side, you'd like to see President Biden on that 2024 ballot. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Run, Joe, run.
Pardon?
Joe, run.
Okay, right. So if he doesn't run, who do you think from the Democratic side? Who would you rather be up against, and who do you think might actually make it?
Well, I don't. Democratic nominations are not my expertise, but I have to say I would have very difficult time believing that they're going to be able to dislodge a sitting Vice President Harris from the nomination. If that's what they want, I think others will run. But from right now, I find it to be sort of incredible to think that she would lose that nomination. But we'll see what happens. I don't think he is going to run, and I think so. I think we'll see what happens in a few months. And I'm on the Republican side. I think clearly. I've thought this for a year and a half. I think Governor DeSantis is going to run. I totally agree with what David said. Really, this goes back to President Obama, who got in at a time when no one thought he was going to win. I think when he did that, it sort of changed the paradigm of the way people think about this. And when it's your time in the sun, you better go because it's not going to last long. And my guess is Governor DeSantis will run. I think when he gets in, which if I were him, I would wait 6 months. I think there's no hurry for him to get in. But I think that'll open the door for a lot of others to dip their toe in the water as well. So I think we'll end up having a robust field, which I think a lot of people would say helps President Trump. I'm sort of dubious of. I'm skeptical of that analysis. Honestly, I think these things. What happens is generally a lot of people get in, they run in the off year, and by the time you get to Iowa, the field's winnowed, and by the time Iowa's over, it's winnowed even further. And it really comes down to a 2 or 3 person race rather quickly. And I think in that scenario, certainly President Trump can win, but that is also a very treacherous process for him.
Ron, Elise, your assessment of the 2024 field, starting with the Republicans.
I differ a little bit from Rob in that I still think that Trump is pretty strong as long as, he's not legally unable to run or physically unable because of health, because it's going to take a while to get to that 2 or 3 person playing field, and a lot of damage can be done to that point. And you look at how many Republicans probably are going to run. You've got Ted Cruz, you've got Mike Pompeo, you've got Nikki Haley, you've got Mike Pence, and then Ron DeSantis. So already that's a pretty large field, and there probably are others who would jump in too. And so I think that the numbers would give Donald Trump a certain advantage. And also he just doesn't care about the Republican Party at all. So he has nothing to lose since he is only all about himself. And so what does he care if he just really, continues to inflict more damage on the party? We've seen how he would rather bite off his nose to spite his face, when it came to the Georgia Senate, back in 2020. So I think a lot of damage and a lot of blood is going to be shed, however this goes on the way out. And DeSantis might just be peaking a little too early, frankly. It's still a long time to go. And while in 2016 it started early, Ted Cruz got in first in March, and then you had Rand Paul in April, and then everyone else gradually got in. So it starts pretty early, but I think it could be just his moment peaking might be premature.
Well, walk us through
But
that.
can I make one point on that? Because I agree with Elise. I just want to make sure we're clear. I believe that President Trump is the favorite. I don't think that's just kind of goes without saying. But I think a year ago, 2 years ago, he was a prohibitive favorite. Now I think he's sort of a nominal favorite. And I think there is a path to winning, to beating him. But it's just like anything else we talked about in these Senate races. You have to run a real campaign. You have to make your case. I think David's right. You have to act like you have to be able to do the job and want the job. And so there's a lot of ifs here. But I do think that there is, if you look at his these Senate races where he was endorsing candidates, most of them got between 35 and 37, 38% of the vote. Herschel Walker is sort of a different category. But these real competitive races, he clearly helped them get over the hump. I mean, there's no question about it. But this wasn't like he was winning 65, 75% of the vote. He was always under 50. I think that's his hard vote is between, like I said, 30 to 35% of the vote, maybe 25 on a bad day, 40 on a good day. And I think there's room to make a case, but people are going to need to do it. And I think, as David said, it's a rough and tumble process anyway. It's going to be really rough and tumble running against President Trump. I think he'll burn the house down to win. But I think he could be defeated in a nominating contest.
Thanks for clarifying. David, do you think President Biden's decision on running again really rests on President Trump's decision in a sense? I mean, Biden said, that he was running to save the soul of America. Clearly, he saw it as his job to try to get President Trump out of office. If for whatever reason, Trump's not able or decides not to run again, does that give kind of Biden an out to, transition to the next generation?
I think Trump announcing he's running will be a factor. I actually think this will be a very personal decision between Joe and Joe Biden. Obviously, they have a lot of grandkids. He's very close to his family. He would be in his 80s in his second term. And I think he needs to decide with his wife if this is how he wants to spend that phase of his life. So I actually think that these tend to be really personal, lonely decisions. You have advisors in your ear about this or that, about whether to run for president, whether to run again. Ultimately, it's a decision they'll have to make. I do think it's a decision that he should make earlier rather than later, so that if he does run, that's clear, and they can begin building a campaign, hopefully to hold on to the White House. And if he doesn't run, it's important to basically give everybody else the chance to get in and see what they've got. And see if that's what Democratic primary voters are looking for. I would say the same thing about Trump. I don't think he's really going to care about that. I think he'll decide, maybe he won't next week say he announces, and he'll keep us all in suspense for months. But I think he'll be less charitable in terms of how he thinks about that timing. I will say this. I mean, back in 2008, which is ancient history, but, Hillary Clinton was a very strong frontrunner back then. And actually, she was in the 40s, so polling higher than Trump does right now. But what we saw was, we assumed she'd win, by the way, but we thought there was a math that was there for us, which is if we could become the one alternative, there was an opening. I think that's true with Trump. But I will say, Rob said he'll burn the house down. The most important thing, whether you're Ron DeSantis or anybody else, in my view, is not your set of policies, not your announcement speech, not your senior staff. That could be important later. It's, can you stay in the ring with the bully? Because if you can't, Trump will just have his way with you. It doesn't mean you need to run his kind of race, but at those key moments, will you take the point and deflect it and throw it? And I think for a lot of Republicans, what they can say is, listen, I think Donald Trump was a great president. He did lots of great things. He can't win. Maybe they say it's because the media is unfair. Maybe it's because he might be under investigation. But I also think there's a sharper message, which is, listen, 2018 was a bad midterm for the Republican Party. He presided over that. 2020, he lost to Joe Biden, of all people. If you're a Republican, that seems pretty outrageous. And then he was a central factor here in what was an election. So I think there's an electoral argument where you can still give Trump credit for a bunch of stuff if you're a Republican, but say, the most important thing as a Republican is to win back the White House, and I don't think he can do it. But again, if you're not willing to be in the ring with somebody who cherishes it, basically knife fighting in a phone booth, then you should run as far away from the presidential race as you can, in my view.
Yeah, well, so President Trump now, I mean, it really is the third federal election in which, in some ways, he has lost. And yet, I think, especially on the left, there are a lot of people who ascribe to him kind of an almost, mystical genius about eventually pulling things out. It sounds like all three of you are not necessarily convinced he can do it again.
I'm certainly not in the mystical genius camp, but I think, look, I think he's a formidable politician. I think if he ran against Biden, it would be a toss-up race. God help us for a lot of reasons, but I think, I think he's formidable, but he's beatable.
Got it. Okay.
How about very stable genius, Joe? Maybe not legacy.
Yeah.
That's right. Okay, one question I'd like all three of you to address. Why are the polls so often wrong? Well, that presumes the question, were they wrong?
I don't think they were wrong. It was all within margin of error, pretty much. That's why I don't really understand there are some polls that are terrible because they're bad pollsters, and to kind of stay away from those. But overall, you can't quibble with it being, plus or minus 5 and pretty much all the races that we're tracking closely.
One thing that I think happened, I generally agree with that. There needs to be some more analysis. One thing that I am sort of interested in is that, generally speaking, in elections like this, if they're close, the undecideds just break for the out party. And so you look at a survey, and I think this is part of the analysis that was sort of people are doing up to the election. Like if we're tied, Republicans would win because they would break this way, or there'd be turnout be in our favor. It seems as though that didn't happen. And so while that's not really a polling issue, it is sort of a change of voter behavior issue relative to the last several midterm elections. But I think it's a little too early to see to figure out exactly what happened. But that's sort of notionally, it seems like that happened, which is interesting to me.
David, on the polls?
No, I think Elise and Rob nailed it. I think there was a sense Republicans had momentum because they brought a bunch of people home, and a view that, well, they had momentum, number one, and number two, the undecided should break disproportionately their way. That didn't happen. We'll learn about why. But I think there was part of it. It's just, again, back in 2020, the polling suggested Biden might win Texas, right? Might win states like Wisconsin and Michigan by 8 or 10 points. So people were, I think, overly cautious. But we it's good to be reminded every election is different, and it has unique characteristics.
So 2 final questions. The first, zooming out a bit, right? Party control of Congress has flipped quite a bit, really, since 1994, right? In fact, I think a congressional scholar said recently that, the control has been less stable, particularly in the House, than in really most any other part of our history. Clearly the country is deeply divided, and it seems that there isn't like a, consensus around one party that's going to emerge anytime soon. Just from a game theory perspective, shouldn't that imply a willingness to compromise?
David?
Yeah. Most importantly, because it's how you get anything done, unless you have, and then secondly, I think there's tend to be good politics. Look at Kemp and Raffensperger and DeWine. Those candidates were rewarded. I wouldn't even consider saying elections are legitimate to be a compromise, but in this environment it was, and they were rewarded. So yeah, but I think what you capture, so we are politically divided. There are swing voters still exist. There's not a lot of them, but in close races, it doesn't take a lot of them. Even last night, we saw so many different outcomes in different states, Republicans winning some offices, Democrats. But what is uniting people is great unhappiness with the economy. And that's been going on for decades. People concerned that, for the first time ever in American history, parents think kids are going to be worse off than they are. People deeply concerned, particularly in certain areas of the country where there seems to be a ceiling on wages. So I think you're going to continue to see volatility, because the big thing is the big thing. It's always, do I feel like I can get ahead? And you can't just look at the unemployment rate, because lots of people are employed, but they're unhappy with their wages. So that's why I think you're having, and I'm always surprised, because you see some political scientists basically say the death of the swing voter. And it's like, I don't know, man, we're having landslide election after landslide elections, chambers change, split ticketing voting. Again, that's not all of us, but even if it's 5 to 8% of us, It makes a big difference in these states.
Rob, on that question?
Look, I actually think voters reward Pauls on both parties who do big things. I just think most of them don't try and do big things anymore. And I think part of it is, not to get in a whole philosophical debate about this, but I think there are two ecosystems in the country now. And I think by and large, most politicians and party members, they live in totally separate like ecosystems. And I think it's, unhealthy for the country. And I think it's led to less sort of constructive legislating. I mean, back when I started in politics, you used to be the off year you'd legislate, and the on year you'd beat the hell out of each other. And now it's like there's zero, there is no sort of legislating. And I don't think that's, I'm a conservative. I'm generally a conservative policy, but at times you need to get things done. And it's harder and harder to do that because people aren't sort of even agreeing on the same baseline anymore like they used to.
Final question. What is the one thing you want our audience to walk away with this afternoon? Elise.
Extreme candidates weren't rewarded last night. And Donald Trump is still very much in the game, and he's not as weak as some in the media have relished this morning. I think I'm still not counting him out at all.
Mm-hmm. Rob?
Look, I think both parties are going through a period of reckoning, and which is going to be sort of hard and for both parties, their own sort of process. And I think the Republicans are a little bit farther down that process than the Democrats are, but I think it'll be worked out in the next, 18 months.
And finally, David.
I think the power of young voters. They showed again last night their power to really drive elections. And I think they're not waiting to be handed the reins of the country. I think they're showing more political involvement, more political activism. More of them are actually running themselves. So I think that's an exciting prospect. Yes, for the Democratic Party, but I would also argue for the country.
David, Rob, Elise, thank you all so much for sharing your insights. This has been really beneficial to me. My name again is Sewell Chan, editor-in-chief of the Texas Tribune. Thank you all for coming, and thank you all for supporting the work of the Brennan Center.
Thanks.